Welcome to this Positively Deviant production. This episode is part of the series Exploring Decision Intelligence, and we're laying out a pedagogy for upskilling the quality of our decisions. Today, we're going to be covering the core skill of existential math and how, by increasing the capacity of our calculations, we can include less visible and less measurable realities in our strategies.
These conversations are deliberately more abstract and may not be immediately easy to understand. And we're not speaking as clinical or academic experts, but introducing a framework that we found to be useful in learning new human intelligence skills that address what I think is missing in current social training, particularly in context of a growing age of artificial intelligence. So we're inviting people to use less developed analytical muscles here. Existential math is my unique idea that we're exploring in the realm of human decision intelligence.
The reason we're focused on this is because we see so many of the problems that arise from not factoring in different kinds of intelligence in our decision making. And existential math is a way to capture and include human intelligence. When we gather more holistic data and then we prioritize that data based on how it impacts both the external and internal outcomes, this is what can lead us ultimately to better results. So we're going to walk through 3 practices related to existential math to help listeners build the skill. First, we're going to talk about what we mean by domains of intelligence. Second, we'll explain what we mean by internal and external variables and how we can factor in the places where they intersect. And then third, we'll unpack how decision-making with existential math relates to future-proofing your decisions.
So first, regarding domains of intelligence, every strategy starts with fact-finding to gather and evaluate information. Existential math is like a strategic process on steroids. And specifically, it's a process of creating strategies that expand beyond our areas of expertise. We can all develop strategies fairly easily within our area of expertise, of course, but learning how to think with more analytical precision in multiple domains that are not in our area of expertise, this is what I'm calling existential math. So let's say you're an engineer or a medical professional. How do you create plans of action that are not within your specialized knowledge set? For example, the classic problem of how do I manage my manager? This is usually a relational strategy. How do I remove bottlenecks and dependencies in my work that are not a part of my job responsibilities? This is an operational strategy. How do I stop getting taken advantage of in whatever role I'm in? This is a systemic strategy. How can I receive the support and freedom necessary to take care of a sick family member? This is social and financial strategy. And how do I reconcile information that needs to align with other departments when no one person is in charge? This is an organizational strategy. And just to make a really big note here, every single one of these examples also requires a political strategy since power structures are involved. Yet none of these strategic domains are what engineers or medical providers went to school for. And still these issues are dominant and prevalent and causing most everyone pain. So existential math is next level critical thinking where people learn how to work with multiple domains of intelligence to solve these kinds of problems.
Yeah, and what we mean by multiple domains of intelligence is that it takes relational intelligence to create relational strategies. And then you need operational intelligence to build operational strategies, and so on. So you can see how it's necessary to be able to zoom into all the details of a problem, but at the same time, we have to be able to zoom out to leverage political intelligence to address the political aspects of the problem, or to gain intelligence about the systems underneath the problem so that you can address those as part of a holistic strategy.
Zooming out and zooming in at the same time is exactly right. And to explain even further, the practice captures details people tend to skip, like social, psychological, political, cultural, and structural information that isn't easy to register. And because we can't see it clearly, isn't included in our analysis and decisions. Existential math tracks some of the elements we're used to in math, like variables, cost, and benefit, but it's not literal math. It's a kind of technical human analysis. I created the term as a way to combine these 3 areas: qualitative analysis, systemic calculations, and all that relates to the nature of being human, which is the existential part.
The second practice is the intersection of internal and external variables and how we can factor in the places where they intersect. To track these variables, I think it helps to picture the quantitative data along one axis. So things like monetary costs, the timeline of a project, the KPIs you use to measure success. Those are all the external things, right, that you can see and measure. And then picture the qualitative data along the other axis. These are the things like the amount of attention you can give a project, the stress it causes you in the context of everything else going on in your life, and even how it impacts your team's mental health. These are the internal things that are more challenging to measure. So, where monetary costs and the amount of attention you have intersect, or where timelines and your stress levels intersect, or where KPIs and your team's mental health intersect. This is where it starts getting really interesting. When external and internal factors collide, and in that intersection, new pieces of intel surface that we can now add into our calculations. This is where existential math lives.
Exactly. The intersections of information and the consequences of those combinations are often less obvious factors to consider. So, as people are metaphorically and in their minds plotting this graph, there is not only a consideration of each variable, but exploring how factors intersect, similar to what you just said, like money and health or individual recognition and community. This is a kind of scientific approach people can take to address these intersections. And this is why existential math is more complex than typical strategy, because the thinking is highly nuanced and more expansively contextual, but it's also way more accurate.
Yeah, for example, we worked with a founder and they were running a sales process that had been vetted by other industry experts and it was working for everybody else, but it wasn't working for them. So we looked at all the internal and external variables one by one and then tackled every place where these factors intersected. We did this to find the points of breakdown within the context of their specific circumstances. So, how their leadership style, the things they prioritized, their work style preferences, all of these less measurable factors were playing a role in undermining the sales process. These specific points of failure actually became the opportunities that we used to solve their problem.
Right. And specifically, what we discovered was that there were other variables at play that the founder wasn't weighing out enough, like anxiety, timeframes and sequencing, and friction with a coworker. We ended up being able to address these indirect root causes that were not being recognized as a part of the problem. And the adjustments that we made became entirely bespoke solution that solved the entire sales problem for the founder and cleared more room for other things that needed attention.
Yeah, and the power of this deconstructive process is that we didn't have to trash the whole sales process or reinvent it, but it also couldn't be followed to a T the way that other people were following it for this particular sales leader. By doing the existential math in this case, we revealed problems that weren't actually part of the sales process, but they were definitely impacting it negatively. So it was easy to see the sales process as the issue. But this founder was able to understand their problem freshly and then reorient themselves to the sales process. So they were able to approach it in a new way.
The idea here is to become vigorous in different ways than we're used to, coming to better decisions and better mental maps from which to operate, especially given the anxiety leaders are facing and the pressure in the decision making process. One way that people can value existential math in today's economy is the resilience it gives leaders when they're problem solving within a tight timeline, under financial stress, within multiple dependencies, and lots of unknowns.
For example, a small business that flips houses, right? Lots of unknowns. They're going to start with a spreadsheet of the purchase costs, right? The rehab budget, materials, labor, holding costs, all the fees associated with buying and selling property, right? To see if a project is worth it, if it's viable, if it's profitable. And all of these measurable factors can be plotted along one axis, everything an investor or a lender would want to see. And then along the other axis, existential math starts to factor in variables like the contractor, the relationship with them, the other projects they have going on, the size and stability of their crew, their subcontractors, and vendor relationships. For the business owners, they also have to factor in the cost of the project in terms of how much of their attention it demands. And what does that mean for the other projects they have going on? How hands-on will they have to be? Even the distance the project is from their house will add up over time when they're getting calls to sign for deliveries or checking in on the contractor. So the primary factors here are time and attention, which if you've ever had to hire and train someone or fire and replace someone, whether it's a contractor or a team member, you've felt how big this factor is, how much it can cost. And then there's the uncontrollable factors like the availability of special vendors or materials that aren't in stock, and how cabinets being held up can cost the project months. So, this brings up the third part where building the core skill of doing existential math relates to future proofing your decisions. If you've ever watched rehab shows on TV or you've remodeled your bathroom, you know decision fatigue from the sheer number of decisions involved is a very real cost. So, existential math helps us include factors like capacity and partnership and timing. And what we're arguing is that the typical spreadsheet accounting, it doesn't accurately represent all of these hidden costs. And because it doesn't include existential factors, it actually can't accurately predict a result. Another way you can future proof your business is by investing in non monetary forms of capital that end up acting as preventative measures when shit hits the fan. Examples of non monetary investments are things like investing in mastery, employees who are deeply invested in, your reputation, and social investments. Existential math prioritizes these investments throughout your decision making process. Existential math can also help future proof your business by assigning a cost to non monetary forms of debt. Examples of non monetary forms of debt are things like tech debt and relational debt and cultural debt. Things like mass layoffs or poor management and broken processes have an enormous cost, especially when the pressure's on. And oftentimes, these existential factors become more obvious over a longer period of time when factors like partnership and privilege and anxiety all play out. When we factor in these long term costs and benefits in our upfront accounting, this is when we end up making decisions that naturally solve for what could be potential problems in the future.
Yes, to everything you just said. I think everyone understands the importance of all these factors. And the best professionals are diligent in many of these less standard consideration, but still most aren't. So one of the advantages of doing this kind of math is gaining mastery in preventing and solving problems. These two business owners who flipped a house were able to creatively solve their problems in atypical ways that aren't embedded in traditional problem solving practices. Existential math, as a part of decision intelligence, is leaning into the reality that when we intelligently engage in the process itself surfaces all kinds of intelligence. Achieving the best goals requires really high quality processing because sometimes we don't have super intelligent goals. And how do we discover that a goal we're making could be better or could be different? It's through analog and manual processing. It's through skilled human math that we find new things.
I want to underline what you just said, that when we use existential math to engage the process of decision making, it surfaces all kinds of new data. It's generative in that way. And so this might feel a little unclear because we can't point you to a list of specific things to check off and then ta-da, you'll make a great decision. Instead, what we're pointing to is this as a way of being, a way of thinking, and that's actually a good thing because it's not limited to a list. This kind of thinking can surface all kinds of new potential outcomes, more than we could possibly list in a podcast. And it can also save us from a lot of miscalculations that we're making along the way.
Another example of a decision that could have used some existential math is with the generous Jones and the miscalculating Michaels. The Michaels ended their friendship with the Jones because they judged their financial struggles, a decision that the Michaels actually eventually regretted. Since the Michaels were not able to consider all the hidden variables, they blamed a symptom, something that rubbed them the wrong way, like financial instability, as a sticking point against their friends. But here's more context. The Michaels were given a company by their parents. Their parents helped them build their house. They were not risk takers, asked for a lot of help from friends and family, and were not particularly generous people. They gave much less frequently, but in critical moments when help was most needed. And this is why they valued their contributions as higher than they actually were, because of the pressure of the crisis that made their giving feel less voluntary. The Jones, on the other hand, were financially ruined from the 2008 crash and, despite all efforts, couldn't recover from the huge loss. They didn't have the same financial or social advantages and were not pursuing the same conservative lifestyle that the Michaels were. Their parents didn't pay for their education or gift them a house and a business, and they had a circumstantial crisis that was out of their control without any family backup. They also had very different personal characteristics and values. They were risk takers, and didn't have as much need for security and were actually giving the friendship far more over time due to their generosity and availability that wasn't quite equal to the Michaels. They gave more frequently and invested in the Michaels' children and helped remodel their home and gave enormous amount of free labor over the years. And they're quite ambitious and had lost everything in trying to make bigger moves, to build their lives back. So one can start to map how these variables for each couple added up in less obvious ways. Both couples gave to each other, but the conditions for giving were different. One not often, but during crisis, and the other in everyday circumstances. Both couples gave to each other in good ways, but the giving over time wasn't actually equal. The Jones gave far more, but it didn't feel like it to the Michaels because they didn't account for all of the variables. But when we evaluate less visible factors like resources and skill and values, we can see how the context for each couple are really different. Overall, the Michaels miscalculated the realities. They didn't start from the same places, didn't have the same obstacles or the same gifts, and didn't account for the strengths of the Jones with the same weight as the perceived weaknesses. The personalities, limitations, and all of these particular variables I just listed don't add up the same for both couples. The Michaels actually didn't experience crisis, and they judge the Jones for having ongoing financial issues because of a crisis versus admiring their ability to continue to make their lives work despite it. And as a result, they misjudge the Jones for being incompetent rather than noticing how skillfully they could problem solve in ways that they could not. And the Michaels also missed looking at the character and the particular skills that the Jones were demonstrating, which were much greater than their own. But because they weren't able to do this math, they came to an inaccurate judgment that resulted in cutting off the friendship. And the same example we've seen over and over in business setting between teammates and managers, founders and investors, owners, compliance. I mean, you name it. It's that common. And eventually the Michaels realized they miscalculated in how they missed the benefits of the relationship from the beginning. They didn't see that the friendship they were letting go of in the name of principle and self-protection was actually going to hurt them, not help them. This also works out in sociocultural ways too, where we collectively fail to recognize that achievement and risk are not so straightforward. Not everyone can take the same risks, as the costs are not the same for everyone. And risk needs to be evaluated inside multiple factors like if you're poor, if you're a woman, a person of color, or disabled. And with some better existential math, many people, like the Michaels, would make smarter determinations, which in this case would have caused them to invest more, not less, in the relationship. And it's a lot to learn a different kind of mental spreadsheet, but this level of analytic thinking is becoming an increasingly necessary skill to succeed, especially in our modern machine-driven world.
Yeah. So now let's dig into where this requires us to overcome social conditioning. There are so many times I've been sitting at the board table, just, jaw dropping about the lack of information being used in the decision making process. And a lot of times it comes from biases in the ways that businesses and the people who are in charge of making them profitable undervalue or underprioritize not only the people, but all of these existential factors we've been talking about. The decision making process that most leaders are engaging in is more machine like in the way that they do the most basic math, considering mostly, if not only, measurable inputs like a machine would. And what we're offering here is to let machines make those decisions. They're great for that. But when it comes to humans engaging in the decision making process, let's do more than the machines can do. Let's factor in, the near breakdown status of one of our employees, or the political climate we're launching a product into, or the lack of respect of one of our team members. Machine-like thinking easily calculates the profit on a flip, but it doesn't calculate existential factors like life experience, or the value of partnership, or the cost of stress. And machines aren't factoring in relational debt from a bad manager, or poor leadership, or low morale. Existential math is the place for leaders and learners to upskill this analog processing, as you called it, and a place where we can invite more human computing as a complement to our, of course, necessary and helpful digital computing.
100% to this. Workers, especially, have been trained through protocols and procedures that are automated and fixed, to various degrees. And they're fundamentally necessary for certain kinds of work, like dangerous or life and death situations. But also, in many human decision-making contexts, these programmed ways are restrictive and less intelligent. We've been conditioned as a society to rely on these fixed ways to create perceived speed and frictionless, repeatable states. But this conditioning is what we're trying to expand beyond by learning existential math so that we can think in multiple ways, not only in automated ways. And as we've been saying, these machine like practices have inadvertently trained humans to work and think in machine like ways, which are incomplete, way less human, and overall less contextually intelligent.
It's this machine like thinking that's programmed us to do such limited calculations in our own lives, like the Michaels cutting off a relationship that actually gave them more than they were giving it. I've seen this play out between a manager and their employee so many times, but where the manager's incorrect judgments are leading them to the wrong conclusion. And it's one that actually hurts the manager and the employee, especially in the long run. And managers do this when they misjudge their team members' work ethic without taking into account the systems they're up against. And older generations judge younger generations as lazy when oftentimes they're actually underengaged or underdeveloped. And we see unrealistic expectations on employees backfiring when employees are actually being taken advantage of. And in their desire for reciprocity, they behave in a way that appears like they're taking advantage of the company, when in fact, they're just trying to get even for the ways that the company is taking advantage of them.
This is exactly the point. What are our own blind spots where we can't gather accurate information because we're not using the appropriate tools and we're not asking ourselves better questions? The process of existential math factors for these places of negative conditioning and bias and judgment. And we know that our judgments are largely inaccurate without the assistance of deep contextual knowledge. And I think there's an altitude concept here too, where we can step out of the immediacy of the day to day, zoom out to challenge our perspective and assumptions, and deliberately seek out data that's missing. This is all a way that existential math helps assemble more information and intelligence to work with. And this is how human intelligence fits into the greater picture of decision intelligence. If the science is plotting all the realities and noticing the intersections and what they're producing, the art of it is that once you're done with all of that, how do you add it all back up? Before individuals can get to a holistic picture, they have to apply all of these internal and external implications. And as you mentioned, start weighing them out, adding a layer of meaning to how variables are ordered in terms of intensity or priority.
Yes. So, what gets in the way of people being able to add it all back up? Ultimately, I think it's primarily two things that I've seen. First, the ego gets in the way, and the decision maker over prioritizes the stuff you can see, which makes sense. It's easy to point to numbers on a spreadsheet as proof for why you're making the decision you're making. And then, second, anxiety. This keeps the decision maker fixated on what they can control, or at least where they have like an illusion of control, even though uncertainty is part of many decisions that we make. Existential math, it actually makes room for the uncertainty. It invites us to think critically about the unknown and then to factor it in. And it leaves space for what could emerge and what will inevitably go wrong along the way.
Yeah, which makes me think, like, at this point, Chelsea, like considering the challenges of all this extra critical thinking, what in your experience makes existential math worth it?
In my personal experience, existential math has helped me become a better thinker. So when I'm making a decision, I'm looking at intel from relational and systemic and political and organizational perspectives all at the same time. So that's also made me a better strategist. It's made me better at sales, better at managing people, certainly a better partner. And it's had a huge impact on reducing the costs of my time and energy and sometimes actual money from pursuing the wrong goal or investing in the wrong people. Because I'm able to look at not only the external list of pros and cons, but also the internal list, I've gotten a lot more savvy at discerning realities, essentially, and piecing it all together. And I've also gotten better at managing my stress and managing other people's stress. Being able to add up all these nuanced realities that span relationships over decades has also made me a better friend, a better colleague. And then by taking the time to do better math up front, it saves me from the kinds of problems that most of us are actually creating for ourselves down the line. So this is where I've learned to future proof my decisions. So my decisions are based on strategies running concurrently that solve problems for both today and for tomorrow. And that all adds up to incredible efficiency over time.
Yeah, yes. And there's no going back once you see the matrix and unplug. It's like the film. But to recap, existential math is a kind of accounting. It accounts for the internal and invisible, like anxiety, motivations, and individual capacity, and factors those into the external and measurable things. And then context matters, the context of human systems versus machine systems. The scope is more expansive, and these multi-dimensional realities that we're speaking to are always present. The information is there, whether we tap into it or not. But too few people are considering all the relevant variables in any given circumstance. It becomes a huge advantage when individuals can get to where the quality of our processing leads us to highly integrated human outcomes, better than the outcomes we initially set out to achieve.
Our overall invitation is to include more than just the quantitative data in your analysis. And congrats if you're already including more of these qualitative, less measurable factors. Many people are. So for you, the challenge becomes noticing the intersection of the internal and external factors and how they relate to one another and what that collision produces. And then using that emergent intel in your calculation to solve for problems before they happen. You can use existential math as a route to reskill your decision making. All right. So if this information is compelling to you, but you're asking yourself how you could even begin to work with it because it sounds so aspirational, but not very tangible, then we'd love to work with you on embedding this into your personal leadership development or on your team or in your company. We offer in-person practicums where we work with these concepts in your real life circumstances so you can reap the benefits. And if you don't want to wait, we've provided questions in the show notes to get you started.
And we have several episodes about core skills that help develop decision intelligence, and we invite you to listen to all those as well.
To engage with us, reach out via the link in our show notes and make sure to click the follow button so you don't miss out on future episodes.